Imagine waking up in a cold, damp hut, the smell of smoke from last night's fire filling your lungs. Outside, the sound of roosters and clanging church bells call you to begin another day. There are no phones, no electricity, no running water. You are not in the 21st century anymore. You are in medieval England. The real question is, could you survive here? Imagine waking up at the first hint of dawn, the sky still a deep gray, with the low sound of roosters crowing and the occasional bark of a dog echoing through your village. The air is damp and cold, seeping through the cracks of the timber, framed hut you call home. These huts are small, often a single room with a thatched roof, dirt floor, and little furniture, sometimes just a straw mattress in a corner. The walls may be covered with a thin layer of plaster, if you're lucky, and there's usually a hearth in the center where a fire is kept alive for cooking and warmth. But warmth is fleeting, and the smoke often stings your eyes, making the morning a constant struggle just to breathe. As you rise from your bedding, you notice the chill creeping through your thin woolen garments. Clothes are not bought for fashion or comfort. They are functional and often homemade. Wool is the most common material, though linen is used when available. Your outfit might be patched in several places, evidence of repairs made because new clothes are expensive and rare. Many families pass down garments, and wearing hand-me-downs is a fact of life. The moment you step outside, the ground beneath your feet is hard, uneven, and sometimes muddy, particularly after rainfall. Paths through the village are narrow, filled with puddles, animal waste, and the occasional stray chicken pecking at whatever scraps it can find. Your first task of the day is likely to tend to animals if your household keeps them, which most peasants do. Chickens must be fed and secured, goats milked if you have them, and pigs guided to areas where they can forage. Animals are essential. They provide meat, milk, eggs, and wool, and their survival is directly tied to yours. Losing an animal can mean a day without food or worse. The work is repetitive and physically demanding, yet there is no modern convenience to ease it. All tools are made of wood and iron, heavy and cumbersome. A wooden bucket is used to carry water from the village well, often a long walk away, and the same bucket might be used to carry both water and animal feed throughout the day. Breakfast is simple. For most peasants, it might consist of bread, porridge, or leftovers from the previous evening. Meat is scarce, except for special occasions, and sugar, if used at all, is a luxury. In the towns and villages, meals are eaten quickly and without ceremony. Families sit on benches or stools around a wooden table, and food is often eaten with the fingers or a simple wooden spoon. Even though you may be poor, hygiene is limited, and the risk of illness from contaminated food or unwashed hands is ever present. Despite this, people make do, and survival often depends on routine and efficiency. Once breakfast is over, it is time to work the land. Agriculture dominates life. The medieval calendar revolves around planting, tending, and harvesting crops. Depending on the season, you may spend hours plowing fields, sowing seeds, or gathering crops like wheat, barley, oats, or vegetables. Heavy wooden plows pulled by oxen or horses are the primary tools for breaking up the soil, and the physical labor is backbreaking. Sun or rain, you are expected to work. There is no concept of weekends, vacations, or paid leave. Your life is defined by the land and the seasons. Farming itself is a team effort. Men often handle the plowing and lifting of heavy materials, while women work in the fields planting seeds, weeding, or harvesting lighter crops. Children are not spared either. From a young age, they are taught to assist in chores, carrying small bundles, feeding animals, or helping with the preparation of food. Life is communal and survival-oriented. Everyone contributes. Festivals and holy days provide brief relief, but even then, Peasants are expected to perform certain duties for the church or their lord. The workday stretches from sunrise to sunset, with only short breaks to eat and rest. The physical toll is immense and injuries are common. Cuts, bruises, and sprains are part of daily life, yet the risk of serious infection looms large because sanitation is poor and medical knowledge limited. At the end of a long day, your body aches and your hands are blistered and calloused. Despite this, life continues because to stop working is to risk starvation or punishment. Meals throughout the day remain simple. Lunch may consist of bread and cheese or some pottage, a type of thick soup or stew made from vegetables, grains, and occasionally a bit of meat. Spices are rare and expensive, only affordable to the wealthy, so flavors are modest. Water and ale are common beverages. Interestingly, ale is consumed by all ages because it is safer than water, which is often contaminated. Brewing your own ale is part of household life, and a small daily ration is considered essential. Education, if it exists, is minimal. Most children, especially in rural areas, learn skills through observation and labor rather than formal schooling. Reading and writing are privileges reserved for the clergy or wealthy merchants. Knowledge is practical, focused on survival, animal husbandry, and maintaining the household. Storytelling is common in the evenings, with elders passing down wisdom, legends, and moral lessons orally. In this way, culture and history persist even when literacy is limited. The home itself, though small, serves multiple purposes. Cooking, sleeping, and work all happen under the same roof. Privacy is almost non-existent. Rooms are dark, lit only by the fire, and sometimes small windows covered with oiled cloth or shutters. Furniture is minimal: benches, stools, a table, and perhaps a chest for storing clothes and tools. Life is hard, but families develop routines that maximize efficiency and survival. Religion plays a central role in daily life. The local church is not just a place of worship, but also a center for community interaction and guidance. Attendance at Mass is expected, and religious festivals provide a rare respite from labor. People pray for protection, health, and good harvests, believing that divine favor directly influences survival. The church also plays a role in mediating disputes, recording births and deaths, and providing moral and social structure in an otherwise harsh world. Weather is an ever-present concern. Harsh winters can devastate crops and lead to famine, while spring floods may destroy planting fields. Clothing and homes offer little protection against extreme conditions. Peasants develop strategies for survival, storing grains, preserving food, reinforcing thatched roofs, and layering clothing. Every season presents new challenges, and every day demands vigilance. Despite the hardships, moments of joy exist. Children play simple games using sticks, stones, or homemade toys. Adults may share stories, songs, or communal meals after harvest. Festivals, fairs, and religious holidays bring communities together. These moments, though brief, remind people of their resilience and create bonds that are crucial for survival. Travel is limited and dangerous. Roads are often little more than dirt paths, muddy and riddled with potholes. Bandits and wild animals pose threats, and towns may be miles apart. The local forest is both a source of food and danger, providing game, wood, and foraging opportunities, but also hiding criminals and predators. Survival requires knowledge of the land, careful observation, and caution at all times. Even leisure activities are tied to survival. Hunting, fishing, and foraging supplement diets. Knowledge of herbs and plants can aid in treating minor ailments or poisoning enemies if necessary. Villagers must be resourceful, creative, and resilient. Daily life in medieval England is a continuous balancing act between labor, sustenance, faith, and community. In the end, surviving medieval England is a matter of adaptation, endurance, and luck. Every day is a test of physical strength, mental resilience, and social skill. The rhythm of life is dictated by seasons, crops, the needs of family and lord, and the whims of fate. Those who thrive are not necessarily the strongest, but those who understand their environment, respect its dangers, and make the most of scarce resources. Life is hard, sometimes cruel, and full of uncertainty, but it is also rich with connection, purpose, and human ingenuity. To imagine surviving in this world is to step into a time when every sunrise demanded effort, every meal was earned, and every day was a fight to live and contribute to the fragile community around you. It is a world both distant and strangely familiar, where the struggle for survival shaped everything from culture to morality, and where the human spirit, tested daily, proved remarkably resilient. Life in medieval England was not only a test of physical endurance and labor, it was also a constant struggle against illness, injury, and the ever-present threat of death. Unlike today, where medicine and healthcare are advanced and accessible, the people of medieval times relied on rudimentary treatments, traditional beliefs, and sheer luck to survive. From the moment you were born, your health was fragile, and every stage of life carried its own dangers. Infant mortality was high, with many children failing to survive past their first year. Midwives were essential in this world, attending births at home, often in the same small huts where families lived. The process was perilous for both mother and child, with little understanding of hygiene or infection. Complications that are treatable today could easily result in death, and survival often depended on the skill of the midwife and the grace of God. If you survived infancy, you still faced a lifetime of risk. Diseases were rampant, spreading easily in crowded villages and towns where sanitation was nearly non-existent. Toilets as we know them didn't exist for the average peasant. Human waste often ended up in the streets or in cesspits near homes, contaminating water sources. Wells and streams, the main sources of drinking water, could carry deadly bacteria. Cholera, dysentery, and typhoid were common killers, striking with little warning and often leaving entire communities devastated. People had no antibiotics, no vaccines, and little understanding of germ theory. Survival often depended on the strength of your body, the cleanliness of your surroundings, and the quickness of your community to provide care. Medical knowledge was primitive and heavily influenced by tradition and superstition. The dominant theory was that of the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Physicians believed that health depended on the balance of these humors, and illness resulted from imbalance. Treatments were aimed at restoring this balance, often through methods that seem bizarre or horrifying today. Bloodletting was common. A physician or barber, surgeon would cut a patient's vein, hoping to draw out excess blood. Leeches were also used to remove blood in a controlled manner. Sometimes these treatments did more harm than good, leaving patients weak and susceptible to further illness. Herbal remedies played a crucial role in medieval healthcare. Plants like willow, garlic, sage, and thyme were used to treat a variety of ailments, from fevers to wounds. Apothecaries sold dried herbs, tinctures, and oils, and families often had their own small collections of medicinal plants. Knowledge of which plants could heal and which could harm was passed down through generations. However, without scientific understanding, dosages were uncertain and remedies were hit or miss. What could cure a minor infection might do nothing against a serious disease, leaving people vulnerable to complications. Infections from minor injuries were a constant threat. A cut from a farming tool, a scrape while tending animals, or even a burn from the hearth could become life-threatening. Without antibiotics, these wounds could fester, leading to gangrene or sepsis. People relied on poultices, herbs, and prayers to combat infection. Pain was a constant companion, with little relief beyond alcohol, opiates in rare cases, or herbal concoctions. The physical resilience of individuals was as crucial as medical knowledge. Those who were strong and healthy had a better chance of surviving injuries and disease. Plague outbreaks were among the most terrifying threats. The Black Death, which swept through Europe in the 14th century, killed an estimated 30–50% of the population. Symptoms were gruesome: fever, vomiting, buboes, painful swellings, and blackened skin. Panic swept through towns as entire families died within days. Quarantine measures were rudimentary, and superstition often guided responses. People believed that the disease was a punishment from God or caused by miasma, bad air. Some turned to flagellation, penance, or herbal charms, hoping to appease divine wrath. Survival often depended more on luck than on any medical intervention. Childhood in medieval England was also perilous. Illnesses like measles, smallpox, and whooping cough claimed many lives. Vaccination did not exist, so communities relied on natural immunity and careful care of the sick. Children were exposed to the same harsh labor as adults, adding physical stress to the constant threat of disease. Nutrition played a key role in resilience. Diets for peasants were limited, often lacking essential vitamins and minerals. Deficiencies such as scurvy or rickets weakened the body, making people more susceptible to infection. Even minor colds could become fatal if the immune system was already compromised. Pregnancy and childbirth remained dangerous for women throughout their lives. Complications such as hemorrhage, infection, and obstructed labor were common causes of death. The knowledge of midwives was invaluable, but their methods were limited by the lack of sterilization and proper surgical tools. Maternal mortality rates were high, and women faced the constant risk of illness during their childbearing years. Contraception was rudimentary, relying on herbs or crude barrier methods, which often failed, contributing to high fertility but also increased maternal danger. Mental health, though rarely documented, was also a concern. People experienced depression, anxiety, and other conditions, often attributed to spiritual or moral failings. Treatments included prayer, isolation, or ritualistic cures. The understanding of the human mind was minimal, and mental illness could lead to social ostracization or institutionalization in religious houses, though these were not designed for therapeutic care. Stress was a constant factor in survival, from the pressures of labor to fear of disease and violence. Psychological resilience was critical to enduring medieval life. Hospitals did exist, but they were few and mostly run by religious institutions. Care was often charitable, offering food, shelter, and prayer rather than effective medical treatment. Physicians were rare and usually reserved for the wealthy. Surgeons performed basic surgical procedures, but without anesthesia or sterilization, even minor surgeries carried high risks. Broken bones could be set, but infection could still be fatal. Amputations were sometimes performed to prevent gangrene from spreading, but without proper care, the procedure was as dangerous as the condition itself. Even the wealthy were not immune to the limitations of medieval medicine. Nobles might have access to better care, herbs, and physicians, but they also faced threats from plague, poor sanitation, and war injuries. Wealth could improve odds of survival, but could not guarantee it. Epidemics and famines did not discriminate, and entire populations could be devastated regardless of social class. Diet and nutrition were closely linked to health. Peasants subsisted on coarse bread, pottage, and occasional vegetables. Meat was rare, and sugar was mostly unavailable. Malnutrition weakened immune systems, making infections more deadly. Seasonal shortages could lead to famine, exacerbating vulnerability to disease. Even those who had access to better food experienced deficiencies by modern standards. The lack of vitamin-rich foods and preservation methods meant that scurvy, rickets, and anemia were common, further complicating survival. Sanitation was another major factor affecting health. Streets in towns were often filled with waste, and human and animal excrement contaminated water and soil. Bathing was infrequent, and the concept of germs was unknown. People relied on washing hands and faces with cold water or using scented oils and herbs to mask odors. Poor sanitation contributed to the rapid spread of infections and epidemics. Villages were small but tightly packed, meaning that disease could travel quickly from house to house. Religious and superstitious practices were intertwined with medicine. People prayed for health, used charms, and performed rituals to ward off disease. Some believed that celestial events, such as eclipses or planetary alignments, affected the likelihood of illness. Pilgrimages to holy sites were common for those seeking cures for chronic conditions or to fulfill vows. Religious belief offered comfort in the face of inevitable death, but it could also dictate medical practices that were ineffective or harmful. Wounds from everyday labor were also life-threatening. A simple farming accident could result in a cut that became infected due to lack of sterilization. Surgeons and barbers would attempt to treat injuries using cauterization, poultices, and herbal ointments. Pain relief was minimal, often relying on alcohol or opiates. Surviving such injuries required both resilience and care from family or community members who could assist with treatment and basic nursing. Pregnancy complications, epidemics, accidents, malnutrition, and the lack of sanitation combined to make health a daily concern for everyone. Survival depended on constant vigilance, adaptability, and cooperation within the community. Families shared knowledge, resources, and skills to ensure that children survived and that adults remained capable of working. The collective effort of households and villages was essential to withstand the challenges of disease and injury. Despite these overwhelming challenges, medieval people developed strategies to survive. Knowledge of herbs, natural remedies, and physical therapies was crucial. Families carefully managed diets, preserved foods, and monitored hygiene as best they could. Communities relied on mutual aid, passing down wisdom from generation to generation. Religious faith provided hope, psychological support, and a framework for understanding suffering. In essence, surviving medieval England required a combination of knowledge, resilience, luck, and social cooperation. Even minor illnesses could become life-threatening, yet the people of the time persevered. They endured harsh winters, famines, plagues, and injuries, relying on practical knowledge, community support, and faith. Their survival strategies shaped their daily routines, social structures, and cultural practices. Understanding health in medieval England is not just about medicine. It's about the human capacity to adapt, endure, and continue life in a world fraught with danger. Living in medieval England meant that health was never taken for granted. Every meal, every walk, every task carried risk. People worked, prayed, and cared for one another in a continuous effort to preserve life. The fragility of existence shaped character, behavior, and relationships. Daily life was a balancing act between work, rest, and care, and the ability to survive depended on skill, wisdom, and often divine favor. To imagine living in this time is to recognize the extraordinary resilience of the human spirit. It is to understand that survival was a complex interplay of labor, environment, knowledge, and social cooperation. It was a world where disease could strike without warning, injuries could be fatal, and medical knowledge was limited. Yet people found ways to endure, to care for family, and to maintain communities. The harsh realities of health and medicine in medieval England defined life, molded society, and left an enduring mark on human history. Imagine walking through the narrow, crowded streets of a medieval English town. The air is filled with the smells of smoke, livestock, and refuse. You hear the chatter of townspeople, the clanging of blacksmiths' hammers, and the occasional shout of a town crier announcing the latest news or royal decree. But lurking beneath the hustle and bustle is a constant awareness of danger, not from nature or disease this time, but from the law itself. In medieval England, law and order were harsh, unpredictable, and brutal. To survive, you had to understand it, obey it, or face consequences that modern people can hardly imagine. Crime was an ever-present reality. Life was harsh, and stealing food or livestock was not uncommon, yet the penalties were extreme. A man caught stealing a loaf of bread could face whipping, branding, mutilation, or even execution, depending on the severity of the crime and the whim of the local lord or magistrate. The law was not applied equally. Social class played a huge role in determining your fate. A noble could commit theft with minimal consequences, while a peasant could lose a hand or life for a minor transgression. The hierarchy of medieval society meant that survival often depended as much on status and connections as on personal morality. Law enforcement was rudimentary. There were no police officers patrolling the streets as we know them today. Instead, local constables, watchmen, and the lord's men were responsible for maintaining order. Constables were usually appointed from among respected townspeople and had the authority to arrest wrongdoers, settle disputes, and oversee public punishments. Their methods were crude but effective, often relying on intimidation and public spectacle to maintain compliance. Communities themselves played a role in enforcement, with neighbors expected to report crimes and assist in capturing criminals. Punishments were public and designed to deter others. Stocks and pillories were common, where a criminal's head and hands would be locked in place for hours or days, exposed to public humiliation and ridicule. Flogging and whipping were administered in marketplaces, with crowds gathering to witness the consequences of disobedience. Branding or mutilation served as a permanent mark, a warning to others not to commit similar crimes. For more serious offenses, hanging was common, and for even greater crimes, such as treason, executions could be grotesque spectacles, designed to instill fear in the populace. The concept of fair trials, as we understand it today, was limited. Trials could be highly arbitrary, relying on local custom, the word of influential witnesses, or even supernatural judgment. Ordeals were sometimes used to determine guilt. A common method was the trial by fire. The accused might have to hold a red, hot iron or walk over burning coals. If the wound healed cleanly, they were considered innocent. If not, they were judged guilty. Similarly, trial by water involved submerging a person. Floating indicated guilt, sinking suggested innocence, though both outcomes were perilous. Such methods reveal the deeply superstitious nature of medieval justice, where divine intervention was expected to reveal truth, often at the cost of human suffering. Punishments extended beyond the individual to the community. If a crime went unsolved, entire villages could be fined or subjected to collective penalties. This created a system where everyone had a vested interest in maintaining order, but it also bred resentment, fear, and tension. Peasants lived under the constant awareness that any misstep could have serious repercussions. not just for themselves, but for their families and neighbors. Social cohesion was enforced as much through fear as through law. The legal system was also deeply tied to land ownership and feudal obligations. Lords held significant power over their tenants and could enforce laws on their estates as they saw fit. Disputes over land, labor, and resources were common, and lords often used the law to assert dominance or extract fines. Serfs and peasants had limited recourse. Appealing to higher authorities was difficult, expensive, and sometimes dangerous. The justice system reinforced social hierarchy, ensuring that the wealthy and powerful maintained control while the lower classes remained subservient. Violence was both a symptom and a method of maintaining order. Feuds between families or villages could escalate quickly, sometimes lasting generations. Banditry on roads and in forests was rampant, and travelers were advised to be cautious. Knights and soldiers sometimes acted as enforcers, but they could also exploit the law for personal gain, raiding villages and seizing goods. The threat of violence was a daily reality, shaping behavior, travel, and social interactions. Self-defense was essential, and carrying a weapon, often a simple club, knife, or farming tool, was common. Corruption was widespread. Judges, constables, and officials often accepted bribes or were influenced by social connections. Justice could be manipulated to serve personal interests, and false accusations were not uncommon. Those without status or influence were vulnerable to exploitation, while wealth and connections could provide protection from even the most serious crimes. Navigating this system required cunning, social awareness, and sometimes sheer luck. Religion intersected heavily with law and order. The church had its own courts and laws, particularly concerning moral conduct, marriage, and heresy. Clergy were often tried in ecclesiastical courts, which were generally more lenient than secular courts. Church laws could also influence secular justice, with excommunication or penance serving as both punishment and social control. Religious beliefs reinforced the idea that law and morality were intertwined, and fear of divine judgment complemented the fear of human authorities. The consequences of law enforcement were not only physical, but social. Public shaming, ostracization, and dishonor were powerful deterrents. Reputation mattered greatly. A person branded a criminal could lose employment, marriage prospects, and community support. Survival depended not only on obeying the law, but on maintaining social standing and avoiding situations that could attract the attention of authorities. Knowledge of customs, local power structures, and influential figures could mean the difference between life and death. Even minor disputes could escalate into legal battles or violent confrontations. Arguments over property, inheritance, or debts often involved neighbors, lords, and legal authorities. Mediation and arbitration were common, but these processes could be biased, leaving the weaker party vulnerable. Legal knowledge was limited, and access to advice was restricted, often favoring the wealthy and connected. Survival required careful negotiation, awareness of local law, and sometimes the ability to fight physically if disputes became dangerous. Traveling to another town or village meant encountering different customs, laws, and enforcement methods. Legal systems were not standardized, and punishments could vary widely between regions. What was acceptable in one village might be severely punished in another. Travelers had to be cautious, observant, and respectful of local norms to avoid trouble. Merchants, pilgrims, and adventurers often carried letters of safe conduct or relied on networks of protection to navigate these risks. Criminals developed strategies to evade justice, hiding in forests, traveling at night, or using disguises were common tactics. Some joined outlaw bands, living outside the law, but surviving through theft, extortion, and raiding. These outlaws were both feared and romanticized in folklore, embodying the tension between law, survival, and morality. Stories of Robin Hood, for instance, reflect this complex relationship between criminality, justice, and social inequality. Punishments could also be ritualistic or symbolic, emphasizing moral lessons. Executions were public events, meant to demonstrate the consequences of wrongdoing and reinforce authority. Bodies might be displayed as a warning, and ceremonies surrounding punishment often involved clergy, officials, and the community. These rituals underscored the seriousness of law and order and the societal expectation that everyone, regardless of status, understood the consequences of violating rules. Warfare, rebellions, and political upheavals further complicated law and order. Soldiers and mercenaries sometimes acted with impunity, exploiting instability to seize goods or punish perceived enemies. Revolts by peasants or townspeople, such as the famous Peasants' Revolt of 1381, were met with extreme brutality, reinforcing the power of lords and the crown. Living in this environment required constant awareness, strategic thinking, and sometimes the courage to comply or resist carefully. Even small towns had their own legal systems, often centered around a lord's manor. Manor courts addressed local disputes, enforced labor obligations, and resolved minor crimes. Attendance was mandatory, and failure to appear could result in fines or corporal punishment. Decisions were made by local officials, often influenced by social connections, personal bias, or the lord's interests. Knowledge of local customs was critical. Misunderstanding rules could be costly. For women, the law presented unique challenges. Property rights, inheritance, and marital status were strictly regulated. Women could be punished for adultery, disobedience, or failing in their domestic duties. Legal protections were limited, and social reputation was crucial. Surviving as a woman required careful navigation of family, community, and legal expectations. Missteps could result in fines, public shaming, or even physical punishment. Merchants and tradespeople also faced legal pressures. Guilds regulated commerce, quality, and pricing, with violations resulting in fines or expulsion. Markets were monitored by town officials, and disputes over contracts or goods could escalate to legal hearings. Knowledge of trade laws, local regulations, and the influence of guilds was essential for economic survival. Failure to comply could lead to bankruptcy, social ruin, or imprisonment. Crime and punishment shaped behavior profoundly. Fear of retribution influenced decisions about travel, work, and social interactions. Obedience to authority was not just a moral obligation, but a practical strategy for survival. Knowledge of legal customs, local enforcement, and community expectations was as important as physical strength or intelligence. The law permeated every aspect of daily life, from labor obligations to family disputes, shaping society in profound ways. Even ordinary villagers had to understand the law's intricacies to protect themselves, knowing when to report crimes, how to testify, and how to navigate disputes could prevent punishment or enhance social standing. Legal literacy, though limited, was a form of survival skill, ensuring that one could avoid unnecessary confrontation or exploit opportunities when possible. Ultimately, surviving in medieval England required mastering a complex interplay of obedience, cunning, and vigilance. Law and order were omnipresent forces, shaping behavior, reinforcing social hierarchies, and controlling the population. Punishments were severe, enforcement was arbitrary, and superstition and religion intertwined with justice. Every choice, from traveling to farming, could have legal consequences. Awareness, adaptability, and understanding the system were as critical as strength or skill. Those who thrived were not only physically capable but socially savvy, aware of risks, and able to navigate a world where the law could be both protector and executioner. Living under such conditions meant that the threat of punishment and the unpredictability of justice were constants. Yet communities persisted, adapting rules, customs, and collective enforcement to maintain order. Social cohesion, vigilance, and respect for authority were survival tools, enabling people to endure life in a world where law and punishment were harsh, public, and unavoidable. Survival in medieval England was never guaranteed, but knowledge of the legal system, awareness of social hierarchies, and careful behavior could tip the balance in your favor. Understanding law and order is not just about crime. It is about how medieval society functioned, how individuals protected themselves, and how communities maintained stability in an unpredictable, often brutal world. Every aspect of daily life, from work to travel to family relations, was influenced by law. Those who understood its rules, exploited its loopholes, or adhered strictly to its demands were the ones who could navigate life with some hope of safety, prosperity, and longevity. If you were born in medieval England, the social class you entered was likely the most important factor in determining whether you would survive, thrive, or struggle every day of your life. Unlike today, where social mobility is possible, sometimes slow, sometimes fast, your status in this era was largely fixed at birth. Whether you were a peasant, a merchant, a craftsman, or a noble dictated nearly every aspect of your existence. The food you ate, the work you did, the dangers you faced, and the opportunities available to you. The social hierarchy was not just a way of organizing society. It was a rigid framework that defined life, death, and every moment in between. At the very bottom of the social ladder were the peasants, who made up the vast majority of the population. Peasants could be free or unfree, the latter often referred to as serfs. Serfs were bound to the land they worked, unable to leave without their lord's permission. Their lives revolved around the land and the obligations they owed to their lord, which could include labor on the lord's fields, a share of their own harvest, or various fees and taxes. Survival for a peasant was a daily challenge. Food was scarce, and diets consisted primarily of bread, porridge, legumes, and occasionally vegetables or meat if they were fortunate. The work was back-breaking, plowing, sowing, tending animals, repairing fences, and maintaining tools consumed nearly all daylight hours. Disease, malnutrition, and harsh weather were constant threats, and leisure was a rare luxury. Yet, despite the hardships, peasants formed the backbone of society, providing the food and labor necessary for the entire social system to function. Peasants' living conditions were cramped and basic. Their homes were small, one-roomed huts with thatched roofs and dirt floors. A single fireplace often served as the only source of warmth and cooking. Furniture was minimal, a bench or two, a simple table, and straw bedding. Privacy was nearly non-existent, and the smell of smoke, animals, and human activity permeated every space. Every household member, including children, contributed to labor. Children began work at a young age, learning the skills necessary for survival and the routines that maintained their families' livelihoods. Education, except for practical labor skills, was virtually non-existent for peasant children, leaving literacy and specialized knowledge to the clergy or wealthier classes. Just above the peasants were the craftsmen, artisans, and merchants. This middle class, though small in number, occupied an important place in towns and market centers. Artisans like blacksmiths, carpenters, and weavers produced goods essential to daily life. Merchants facilitated trade, connecting towns and regions, bringing in goods from distant lands. While they enjoyed more autonomy and wealth than peasants, their lives were far from secure. Competition, fluctuating demand, taxes, and the occasional theft or riot threatened their livelihoods. Success required skill, business acumen, and the ability to navigate local laws, guild regulations, and social networks. Guilds were crucial for artisans and merchants, providing training, protection, and quality control. Membership in a guild could secure your reputation and income, but it also meant adherence to strict rules and obligations. Education and literacy distinguished this emerging middle class from the peasantry. Sons of merchants and craftsmen might learn bookkeeping, basic arithmetic, or the management of trade, while daughters could be trained in household management, textile work, or other skills that contributed to family wealth. Access to education, however, was limited and expensive. Literacy and numeracy were valuable assets, providing opportunities to advance socially or economically. Even so, opportunities for true social mobility were rare. Most individuals remained within their inherited social station, navigating the boundaries of their class rather than transcending them entirely. Nobility and the landed gentry occupied the top levels of society, enjoying privileges and protections that were unimaginable to the lower classes. Nobles held land granted by the king or inherited from ancestors, and this land was the source of their wealth, power, and security. Life for a noble was vastly different from life for a peasant. Meals were abundant and varied, often including meat, fish, bread, cheese, fruits, and imported spices. Castles or manor houses provided shelter, defense, and status, with rooms decorated, furniture crafted, and spaces designed to impress visitors. Nobles could focus on administration, hunting, warfare, and social maneuvering rather than the daily struggle to survive. Yet even they were not free from danger. Political intrigue, rebellion, disease, and warfare threatened their lives and fortunes. The hierarchical system also dictated legal privileges and responsibilities. Nobles could pass judgment on their lands, enforce laws, and collect taxes from those beneath them. They were expected to provide protection to their tenants in exchange for labor and loyalty. Knights, often from noble families, served as warriors, bound by codes of honor and loyalty to their lord or the king. Warfare was a defining feature of noble life, and success or survival depended on military skill, alliances, and strategic marriages. Social status was both a shield and a responsibility. While the wealthy enjoyed comfort and power, they also bore the burdens of leadership, defense, and reputation. Social mobility was limited, but it was not impossible. Marriage could sometimes shift status, particularly when wealth, land, or titles were involved. Exceptional skill in trade, military service, or the church could also provide opportunities for advancement. For instance, a successful merchant might acquire land or gain influence in local government, while a talented soldier could be knighted and enter the ranks of the gentry. Nevertheless, the rigid structures of society meant that such cases were exceptions rather than the rule. Most people's lives were defined by birth, and daily survival often depended on learning how to navigate the limitations and expectations of one's class. The influence of social class extended to every aspect of life, including diet, clothing, education, and leisure. Peasants wore coarse woolen garments, often patched and reused, while the middle class could afford finer fabrics like linen, and nobles displayed their status with silk, velvet, and elaborate embroidery. Hairstyles, accessories, and colors were also markers of status. Sumptuary laws sometimes dictated what different classes could wear, reinforcing social distinctions and controlling appearances. Leisure and entertainment were equally class-dependent. Peasants enjoyed simple games, storytelling, and seasonal festivals, while the nobility attended feasts, jousts, tournaments, and theatrical performances. Music, dancing, and art flourished among the upper classes, reflecting wealth and cultural influence. The church played a role in regulating leisure, often integrating religious observances with festivals, fairs, and public celebrations. Social life was intertwined with class, reinforcing hierarchies and shaping expectations. Social class also affected access to justice. Legal outcomes were heavily influenced by status, wealth, and connections. A noble accused of theft might receive a fine or be exonerated, while a peasant could face mutilation or death for a similar crime. Access to legal representation, the ability to bribe officials, or the support of powerful allies could determine outcomes. Justice was not blind. It reflected the social realities of the time, where hierarchy dictated both privileges and vulnerabilities. Health and nutrition were strongly tied to class. Peasants suffered from malnutrition and had limited access to medical care, while wealthier individuals could afford better diets, physicians, and remedies. Life expectancy varied, with the lower classes facing shorter lives due to labor, disease, and scarcity. Even among nobles, the risks of childbirth, plague, and warfare were ever present, but the resources to mitigate these risks were far greater. Class dictated not only survival, but the quality of life and opportunities for longevity. The church, while a unifying institution, also reinforced class distinctions. Clergy occupied a separate status, often educated, influential, and sometimes wealthy. Monks, priests, and bishops played roles in governance, education, and social services, mediating between classes and providing spiritual authority. Religious practices and obligations were experienced differently depending on status, with the wealthy supporting churches, commissioning art, and engaging in pilgrimages, while peasants participated through local observances and festivals. Peasant communities developed strategies to cope with their status. Mutual aid, shared labor, and local customs provided social safety nets. Festivals, fairs, and seasonal celebrations offered temporary respite from labor and reinforced community bonds. Despite hardships, peasants cultivated resilience, resourcefulness, and a sense of solidarity that allowed them to endure the demands of their position. The medieval social system was deeply interdependent. Peasants produced food that fed the nobility, merchants facilitated trade, and the nobility provided protection and governance. Each class relied on the others, yet inequality was stark, and opportunities for upward mobility were limited. Understanding these dynamics was essential for survival. Knowing one's place, navigating obligations, and leveraging social networks could mean the difference between stability and hardship, prosperity and destitution, life and death. Even within classes, hierarchies existed. Among peasants, wealthier landholders could command respect and influence, while poorer laborers faced additional vulnerability. Among the nobility, the proximity to the king or powerful lords could determine influence, wealth, and security. Social navigation was a constant, requiring awareness of relationships, alliances, and obligations. Survival was as much about social skill as it was about physical labor or intelligence. Children learned their roles early, internalizing expectations and observing interactions between classes. Gender further shaped experience, with women's responsibilities defined by both class and social norms. Peasant women worked in the fields and managed households, while noble women oversaw estates, arranged marriages, and participated in courtly life. Marriage was both a social and economic tool, reinforcing class structures and alliances. Survival required adherence to social norms, skillful negotiation of duties, and awareness of hierarchical relationships. In towns and cities, social stratification was evident in urban planning. Wealthier residents lived in sturdier homes closer to marketplaces and trade centers, while the poor resided in crowded, less sanitary areas. Guild halls, churches, and public buildings reflected the status of their patrons and the economic hierarchy of the town. Social class influenced access to resources, opportunities for trade, and protection from hazards like fire, theft, or disease. Ultimately, surviving in medieval England depended on understanding, respecting, and navigating the complex social hierarchy. Birth determined much, but skill, alliances, and resourcefulness could improve circumstances slightly. Awareness of one's position, obligations, and opportunities was essential. Every decision, from labor to marriage to travel, was influenced by class. The rigid structure provided stability, but also imposed limits, shaping daily life, ambitions, and the possibilities for survival. Social class in medieval England was more than a label. It was a framework that governed every aspect of life, from food and clothing to work, justice, and leisure. It determined the risks you faced, the resources available, and the strategies necessary for survival. Understanding the hierarchy, navigating its demands, and leveraging opportunities where possible were critical for enduring the harsh realities of the time. Survival was a product of birth, environment, and ingenuity, intertwined with the obligations, privileges, and protections of one's social position. Life in medieval England was never free from danger, but for men, and even some women, warfare posed one of the greatest threats to survival. Unlike today, where conflict is largely managed by professional armies and modern states, in medieval times, war was a constant presence. It shaped society, dictated allegiances, and often determined life or death. From the local skirmishes over land and resources to massive campaigns like the 100 Years' War, warfare influenced every aspect of life, even for those who did not wield a sword or wear armor. Survival in this context required physical courage, strategic thinking, and a constant awareness of danger. For men of fighting age, the likelihood of being called to battle was significant. Feudal obligations required vassals to provide military service to their lords in exchange for land or protection. A young man might be trained from childhood in the arts of combat, swordsmanship, archery, horsemanship, preparing for campaigns that could last months or years. Training was grueling, emphasizing endurance, strength, and discipline. Those who failed to master these skills often faced humiliation, exclusion, or death in the battlefield. Even peasants, though not trained to the level of knights, could be conscripted to serve as foot soldiers, wielding simple weapons such as spears, axes, or bows. The call to arms was a harsh reality, and refusal could result in punishment or loss of livelihood. Battles themselves were brutal and chaotic. Armies were relatively small compared to modern standards, but the violence was intense. Knights in heavy armor clashed with swords and maces, while archers launched volleys of arrows that could pierce flesh and armor alike. Foot soldiers struggled in close combat, often untrained and poorly equipped. The battlefield was a place of confusion, blood, and relentless noise. The cries of men and horses, the clash of steel, and the scent of sweat and blood. Survival often depended on a combination of skill, strength, and luck. Even the most capable warriors could be felled by a single blow or struck down in the stampede of retreating men. Wounds from combat were frequently fatal, not only because of the injury itself, but because of infection. Medicine, as primitive as it was, could do little to treat serious battlefield injuries. A deep cut, a broken bone, or a punctured wound could become septic, leading to fever, gangrene, and death. Amputation was sometimes performed as a desperate measure, but without anesthesia or sterilization, it carried its own risks. The chances of surviving a major injury were slim, and soldiers often returned home weakened or permanently disabled, their ability to work and support families compromised. Sieges were another defining aspect of medieval warfare. Castles and fortified towns were both defensive strongholds and focal points of military campaigns. Attacking a castle was a grueling, dangerous endeavor. Soldiers had to contend with boiling oil, arrows, and defensive fortifications. Hunger, disease, and exposure were as deadly as enemy weapons during prolonged sieges. Those trapped inside a besieged fortress faced starvation, unsanitary conditions, and psychological stress. Outside, attackers risked ambush, counterattacks, and the same perils of disease and fatigue. Survival in a siege demanded endurance, strategy, and an understanding of the harsh realities of prolonged conflict. The life of a soldier was not limited to the battlefield. Campaigns required long marches across difficult terrain, often with insufficient food, water, or shelter. Soldiers faced exposure to harsh weather, freezing winters, scorching summers, and relentless rain. Exhaustion, malnutrition, and disease were constant companions. Typhus, dysentery, and other illnesses spread rapidly among troops, sometimes killing more men than actual combat. Those who survived these campaigns had to rely on sheer resilience and the support of comrades to make it home alive. War also affected civilians. Villages and towns were not safe havens. They were often the targets of raiding parties, pillaging, and forced conscription. Homes could be burned, livestock stolen, and crops destroyed. Famine could follow, leaving survivors weakened and vulnerable to disease. Women, children, and the elderly faced unique threats: sexual violence, displacement, and the collapse of social support networks. Surviving war as a civilian required vigilance, community cohesion, and sometimes flight to safer regions. Naval warfare played a role as well. England, with its extensive coastline, faced threats from foreign invaders and pirates. Coastal communities lived in fear of sudden attacks, and ships were vital for defense, trade, and supply. Naval engagements were perilous, with wooden ships vulnerable to fire, storms, and cannon or arrow attacks. Sailors faced drowning, hypothermia, and combat injuries, and survival required both skill at sea and luck. The threat of attack influenced settlement patterns, trade routes, and defensive strategies across the country. Mercenaries and private armies added complexity to medieval warfare. Lords and wealthy individuals could hire bands of professional fighters whose loyalty depended on pay rather than allegiance. These soldiers could be ruthless, sometimes turning against civilians or committing acts of violence for profit. Ordinary people had to navigate this unpredictable landscape, avoiding encounters when possible and developing strategies to survive unpredictable violence. Knowledge of terrain, local alliances, and escape routes could mean the difference between life and death. Survival also depended on political acumen. Wars were not only fought with swords, but with alliances, marriages, and diplomacy. Nobles navigated complex relationships to protect their lands, maintain influence, and avoid destruction. Peasants, while less involved in high politics, were affected by these decisions, as the movement of armies, taxation, and requisitioning of supplies directly impacted their survival. Understanding the shifting political landscape, even at a local level, could help families avoid disaster. For knights and men-at-arms, personal honor and reputation were intertwined with survival. Courage, loyalty, and skill were expected, but so was the ability to adapt and retreat when necessary. Overconfidence could be fatal, while careful strategy and alliances could preserve life and wealth. Training, equipment, and access to resources determined who survived battles and who perished. Even the most skilled warriors depended on their comrades, armor, and weapons for survival in a world where one mistake could be fatal. Psychological resilience was as crucial as physical endurance. The constant presence of death, injury, and uncertainty took a toll on soldiers and civilians alike. Fear, stress, and trauma were daily companions, and coping mechanisms included religion, camaraderie, and ritual. Superstition and belief in divine protection also played a role, as many viewed survival as dependent not only on skill, but on the favor of God. Pilgrimages, prayers, and charms were part of the mental preparation for both combat and everyday life during wartime. Supply lines and logistics were vital to survival. Armies required food, water, weapons, and shelter, and disruptions could be disastrous. Starvation was as lethal as any weapon. Civilians often bore the burden, providing food, labor, and shelter to passing armies, sometimes willingly, sometimes under duress. Failure to provide supplies could result in violent retaliation, while scarcity could lead to rebellion, theft, or collapse of social order. Those who understood supply management, either as leaders or skilled laborers, had a better chance of surviving the chaos of war. Mercy and diplomacy played roles in survival as well. Surrendering at the right time, negotiating ransoms, or offering tribute could preserve life and property. Towns and castles sometimes negotiated terms with invading armies, avoiding slaughter but paying heavy penalties. Understanding when to fight, when to flee, and when to negotiate was crucial for survival in a society where violence was constant and law enforcement was unpredictable. Warfare also shaped the economy. Resources were diverted to defense, trade could be disrupted, and labor shortages affected agriculture and production. Civilians had to adapt, sometimes taking up arms, fleeing to safer regions, or relying on communal networks for protection. Survivors needed resilience, resourcefulness, and knowledge of both military and social landscapes to endure the consequences of continuous conflict. Even outside of formal battles, danger was omnipresent. Bandits, raiders, and mercenaries preyed on travelers and villages. Roads were dangerous, forests provided hiding places for criminals, and law enforcement was limited. Survival required vigilance, awareness of surroundings, and preparation for sudden threats. Knowledge of terrain, allies, and escape routes often determined who survived and who became a victim. The experience of war also reinforced social hierarchies. Nobles and knights wielded weapons, commanded armies, and directed strategy, while peasants were often conscripted, providing manpower with little control over outcomes. Survival was unevenly distributed, depending heavily on social status, wealth, and military skill. The poor bore the brunt of violence and deprivation, while the wealthy had better protection, resources, and opportunities to avoid direct danger. Training, preparation, and equipment were essential. A man without armor, a shield, or proper weaponry was unlikely to survive extended combat. Even the best-equipped soldier faced risks from disease, fatigue, and environmental hazards. Military experience, strategic thinking, and physical conditioning improved odds, but randomness and luck played a constant role. Many skilled fighters fell in battles due to unforeseen circumstances, an enemy ambush, collapsing fortifications, or a sudden outbreak of disease. Survival extended beyond the battlefield. Returning home, soldiers faced reintegration into civilian life, coping with injuries, trauma, and the potential loss of family members or property. Rebuilding livelihoods could take years, and communities often had to adapt collectively to the losses and disruptions caused by war. Resilience was as much about social support, adaptation, and resourcefulness as it was about physical skill. Women and children survived war in different ways. They took on increased responsibilities at home, managed farms, and cared for the wounded or sick. Women could inherit land, manage estates, and sometimes organize defenses in the absence of men. Children learned skills and knowledge necessary for survival, witnessing firsthand the dangers and strategies employed by adults. Families that coordinated, prepared, and adapted were more likely to survive prolonged conflicts and the hardships that followed. Religion and superstition also influenced survival strategies. Many believed that divine favor could protect them in battle or shield their homes from harm. Pilgrimages, prayers, and rituals were common, providing both psychological comfort and social cohesion. Religious institutions often offered shelter, aid, and guidance during wartime, serving as critical support networks for communities affected by conflict. Ultimately, surviving war in medieval England was a combination of skill, luck, and adaptability. Physical strength, martial ability, strategic thinking, social connections, and resourcefulness were all critical. Yet even the most prepared individuals could be struck down by disease, famine, or sudden violence. Survival was never guaranteed, and life during wartime required constant vigilance, courage, and resilience. The threat of war influenced every aspect of life, shaping settlement patterns, trade, labor, and family structures. Men and women alike had to be aware of military obligations, the movement of armies, and the vulnerabilities of their communities. Those who survived did so through preparation, knowledge, social networks, and the ability to adapt to an unpredictable and often violent world. The experience of war was not only about combat. It defined social hierarchies, daily routines, and the strategies necessary for enduring one of the most dangerous periods in human history. Living in medieval England meant accepting the reality that war was a constant companion. Every harvest, every journey, and every interaction carried the potential for conflict. Those who survived understood the risks, prepared meticulously, and relied on both personal skill and communal support. To endure in this era required courage, intelligence, resilience, and a deep understanding of the world's dangers. Survival was an art, a science, and ultimately a matter of chance. So, could you survive medieval England? If you were tough, lucky, and avoided disease, famine, and war, you might, but let's be honest, most of us today wouldn't last a week. Still, imagining life in that world makes us appreciate the comforts we take for granted. Clean water, medicine, and even something as simple as a hot shower. So, what do you think? Would you survive medieval England, or would history swallow you whole? Let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed this journey back in time, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more history deep dives. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.